The massive space station hung in the void like a glittering jewel. Its metal surface reflected the light from 3 different suns as it slowly turned around the planet Nexus Prime. Inside the station, hundreds of beings from across the galaxy moved through corridors that stretched for miles in every direction. Lihanna walked quietly through the main hall, her soft footsteps barely making any sound on the polished floor. She was small compared to most of the aliens around her. Her black hair was tied back in a simple style, and she wore a plain blue diplomatic uniform that looked almost boring next to the bright colors and strange shapes of the other species' clothing. Behind her walked Kongde, a tall human man with broad shoulders. He wore the dark green uniform of Earth's diplomatic security force. His eyes moved constantly, watching everything around them as they made their way to the central meeting chamber. Other beings stared at the 2 humans as they passed. Some pointed and whispered to each other in languages that sounded like grinding metal or hissing steam. A few laughed openly, showing teeth that looked like broken glass or tongues that split into 3 parts. Hannah kept her face calm and peaceful. She had trained for this moment for 3 years. Earth had finally been accepted into the Galactic Council, but only as the newest and lowest-ranking member. The other species saw humans as weak newcomers who had somehow managed to build spaceships. Despite being soft and fragile, the meeting chamber was enormous. The ceiling rose hundreds of feet above them, and the walls curved in a perfect circle. Seats were arranged in rings, with each species having their own section. The most powerful species sat close to the center, while the weakest were placed near the outer walls. The human section was at the very edge, almost behind a support pillar. Only 3 chairs had been provided for the entire human delegation. Hannah sat in the middle chair, with Kongde on her right and Ambassador Yule on her left. Ambassador Yule was an older man with gray hair who had spent 20 years preparing for this day. Near the center of the chamber sat Warlord Vexstar and his son Torkin. They belonged to a species called the Kethmori, who looked like walking lizards covered in dark green scales. They were each nearly 8 feet tall, with long arms that ended in claws sharp enough to cut through metal. Their eyes glowed yellow in the dim light of the chamber. Torkin kept turning around in his seat to stare at the human section. Each time he looked at them, he would say something to the aliens sitting nearby, and they would all laugh together. The sound reminded Hannah of rocks falling down a cliff. The meeting began with speeches from the most important species. Each one talked about trade routes, mining rights, and territorial boundaries. The words were translated into hundreds of languages through small devices that every delegate wore in their ear. When it was time for the human delegation to speak, Ambassador Yule stood up slowly. The chamber became quiet, but not because anyone was interested in what he had to say. They were quiet because they wanted to hear what the weakest species in the galaxy would dare to ask for. Ambassador Yule spoke clearly and calmly. He talked about Earth's desire to participate in peaceful trade. He mentioned the resources that Earth could offer and the knowledge humans had gained during their short time in space. His words were polite and respectful, exactly what a species in their position should say. But as he spoke, the laughter began. First, it was just a few quiet chuckles from the back rows. Then it grew louder as more species joined in. By the time Ambassador Yule finished speaking, half the chamber was laughing openly. Torkin stood up without waiting to be recognized. His voice boomed across the chamber as he spoke in the common galactic language. "Look at them," he said, pointing one clawed finger at the human section. "They sit there in their tiny corner like frightened children. They speak of trade and peace because they know they are too weak to take what they want." More laughter filled the chamber. Some of the aliens began making comments to each other about how soft human skin looked and how easily it would tear. Torkin continued his speech, walking closer to the human section as he spoke. "My father has conquered 12 star systems. Our armies have never been defeated in battle. We take what we want because we are strong enough to hold it." He stopped directly in front of Hannah and looked down at her with his glowing yellow eyes. "But these humans," he said, his voice getting louder, "they ask for permission like servants begging for scraps. Look at this one." He pointed at Hannah, who continued to sit calmly in her chair. "She is so soft and quiet. I bet she has never even seen a real fight. This is what the great human species sends to represent them. A small, weak female who looks like she might cry if someone speaks too loudly. The laughter grew even louder. Aliens from dozens of different species were now pointing at Hannah and making jokes about how fragile humans must be if this was their best diplomat. Kang Dae started to stand up, his hand moving toward the weapon on his belt, but Hannah reached out and touched his arm gently. He looked at her face and saw something in her eyes. That made him sit back down. Torkin noticed the movement and laughed again. Even their warrior needs permission from the soft female before he can act. How pathetic. Warlord Vexstar stood up from his seat in the center of the chamber. His voice was like thunder rolling across the room. My son speaks the truth. We have allowed these humans into our council out of curiosity, but perhaps that was a mistake. They clearly do not understand how the strong survive in this galaxy. He walked over to where his son stood and placed one massive clawed hand on Torkin's shoulder. The Kethmori have ruled through strength for 1,000 years. We respect only those who can prove their power in battle. These humans seem to think that pretty words and polite manners will earn them a place among us. The warlord looked directly at Hannah. Tell me, small human, have you ever held a weapon? Have you ever felt the blood of your enemies on your hands? Have you ever proven that you deserve to breathe the same air as warriors? Hannah stood up slowly. The chamber became quiet again as every eye turned to watch her. She was so much smaller than the aliens around her that she looked like a child standing among giants. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. Every word could be heard throughout the massive chamber. I have studied the customs of many species, she said. I know that among the Kethmori, strength is the only thing that matters. I respect your traditions, just as I hope you will learn to respect ours. Torkin laughed so hard that he bent over at the waist. Respect? You want us to respect weakness? You want us to pretend that your soft species deserves to stand equal with true warriors? He straightened up and looked at his father. Perhaps we should show them what real strength looks like. Perhaps they need to learn their proper place in this galaxy. The chamber filled with excited whispers. Many of the alien species had never seen a direct challenge issued in the council chamber before. They sensed that something important was about to happen. Hannah remained standing, her hands clasped peacefully in front of her. Her face showed no fear, no anger, no emotion at all. She simply waited to see what would happen next. The tension in the room grew thicker with each passing second, as father and son exchanged glances, deciding how far they were willing to push the small human who stood before them, without showing any sign of backing down. The formal dinner hall was even more impressive than the meeting chamber. Long tables stretched across the room like bridges, each one carved from a single piece of rare crystal that glowed with soft light. The ceiling was made of clear material that showed the stars beyond, making it feel like they were dining in open space. Each species had their own section of the hall, with special food and drink prepared for their particular biology. The human table was small and placed near the back corner, almost hidden behind a decorative plant that grew as tall as a tree. Hannah sat quietly at the human table, using simple metal utensils to eat food that had been specially prepared to be safe for human consumption. The meal was bland compared to Earth food, but she ate without complaining. Ambassador Yule sat across from her, speaking in low tones about tomorrow's trade discussions. Kang Dae sat beside her, his eyes constantly moving to watch the other species in the hall. The noise in the dining hall was incredible. Hundreds of different species ate, drank, and talked in their own languages. Some made sounds like grinding machines. Others whistled or clicked or made noises that humans had no words to describe. The translation devices in everyone's ears worked constantly to turn the chaos into something understandable at the center of the hall. The Kethmori table was the largest and loudest. Warlord Vexstar sat at the head of their table like a king on his throne. His dark green scales caught the light from the crystal tables, making him look even more dangerous than he had in the meeting chamber. Around him sat a dozen other Kethmori warriors, all of them laughing and drinking from large metal cups. Torkin sat at his father's right hand, but he was not paying attention to the conversation at his own table. Instead, he kept looking across the room at the human section. Each time he looked, his yellow eyes seemed to glow brighter with anger or amusement. As the meal continued, Torkin began to drink more heavily. The Kethmori alcohol was green and thick, and it seemed to make him more aggressive with each cup. He started speaking louder, making sure his voice could be heard across the entire dining hall. "Look at them," he said, pointing at the human table. "They sit in their corner like frightened animals. They eat their tasteless food and speak in whispers because they know they do not belong here." Some of the other species at nearby tables began to listen to his words. The humans were clearly the weakest species in the hall, and everyone knew it. Torkon stood up from his chair and picked up his drinking cup. The green liquid inside seemed to glow with its own light. He walked away from his table and began moving across the hall toward the human section. Kongdae noticed him coming first. He touched Hannah's arm gently and nodded toward the approaching Kethmori warrior. Hannah looked up from her food and watched calmly as Torkin walked toward them. Weaving slightly from the effects of the alcohol, other aliens in the hall began to notice what was happening. Conversations grew quieter as more and more beings turned to watch. Some stood up from their tables to get a better view. The air in the hall became thick with tension. Torkin stopped directly in front of the human table. He was so tall that, even standing while they sat, he towered over all three humans. His clawed hands gripped his drinking cup so tightly that small cracks appeared in the metal. "I have been thinking about our conversation earlier," he said, his words slightly slurred from the alcohol. "I realized that I was not clear enough about the position of humans in this galaxy." He raised his cup high above his head and looked down at Hanja. "You are not just weak, you are nothing. You are less than the smallest insect on my home world, and I think it is time you understood that." Before anyone could react, Torkin tipped his cup and poured the green alcohol all over. Hannah, the liquid was cold and thick, and it had a smell like burning metal. It soaked through her diplomatic uniform and dripped onto the floor around her chair. The dining hall became completely silent. Even the constant background noise of eating and drinking stopped as every being in the room stared at what had just happened. Hannah did not move. She sat perfectly still as the green liquid dripped from her hair and clothes onto the crystal floor. Her face remained calm and peaceful, showing no anger or embarrassment. She looked up at Torkon with the same quiet expression she had worn. All day. Kongdae started to rise from his chair, his hand moving toward his weapon. But once again Hannah reached out and touched his arm. This time her touch was firmer, and her eyes met his with a look that clearly said to wait. Torkin saw the exchange and laughed loudly. The sound echoed through the silent hall like breaking glass. "Even now she stops her warrior from defending her honor," he announced to the room. "This is what humans call strength. This is what they send to represent their species. A female so weak that she will not even fight back when insulted." He threw his empty cup onto the table, where it landed with a loud crash that made several nearby aliens jump. In Kethmori culture, anyone who allows such an insult without response is considered lower than dirt. They have no honor, no value, no right to exist. Warlord Vextor had risen from his seat and was walking across the hall to join his son. His footsteps sounded like thunder on the crystal floor. When he reached the human table, he looked down at Hannah with disgust clearly visible on his scaled face. "My son has shown great mercy," the warlord said in his deep, rumbling voice. "Among our people, such an insult would normally be answered with death. But perhaps death is too good for creatures who have no concept of honor." He placed his hand on Torkin's shoulder with obvious pride. "You have proven what we all suspected. Humans are not just physically weak, they are weak in spirit as well. They accept humiliation because they know they cannot fight back." Torkin nodded and looked around the room at all the watching aliens. "I challenge any human to prove me wrong," he declared loudly. "If they have even the smallest amount of courage, let one of them face me in single combat. Let them show this gathering that they deserve to breathe the same air as real warriors." He looked directly at Kongdae. "You human warrior, you wear the uniform of a fighter, but you take orders from this weak female. Are you brave enough to face me, or will you hide behind her like a child hiding behind his mother?" The challenge hung in the air like a physical thing. Every being in the hall understood what had just happened. In galactic culture, such a direct challenge could not be ignored without losing all respect and status. Day looked at Hannah, waiting for her decision. Ambassador Yule leaned forward, his face pale with worry. At entire human delegations. Future in the Galactic Council might depend on what happened in the next few moments. But before Kongdae could respond, Hannah stood up slowly. The green alcohol continued to drip from her clothes as she rose to her full height. which barely brought her up to Torquen's chest. When she spoke, her voice was still soft and calm, but somehow it carried clearly to every corner of the silent hall. "I accept your challenge," she said simply. The hall erupted in shocked whispers and gasps. Torquen's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with cruel amusement. He began to laugh again, but this time the sound had a sharp edge of anticipation. "You," he said, looking down at the small human female covered in his alcohol. "You think? You can fight me," Hannah nodded once. "Single combat, tomorrow, in whatever arena you choose, under whatever rules your culture demands." Warlord Vextar joined his son's laughter. "This is even better than I hoped," he rumbled. "The soft human female thinks she is a warrior. This will be the most entertaining thing to happen in the council chambers for years." The news of the challenge began to spread through the hall like wildfire. Aliens rushed to contact their home worlds to tell them about the incredible event that was about to take place. A human, the weakest known species in the galaxy, had just challenged one of the most feared warriors of the Kethmori to single combat, and it was not even the male human warrior who had accepted the challenge. It was the small, quiet female diplomat who looked like she might break if someone touched her too roughly. As the dinner hall filled with excited chatter and the sound of communication devices activating, Hannah calmly walked toward the exit. She did not look back at Torquen or his father. She did not acknowledge the stares and whispers that followed her across the room. Tomorrow would bring either victory or death, and she had preparations to make. The combat arena was built in the lowest level of the space station, deep in its metal heart where the artificial gravity was strongest. The floor was made of dark metal that had been scratched and dented by thousands of previous battles. Seats surrounded the arena in rising circles. Like an ancient Roman Colosseum built for the stars, every seat was filled. Beings from across the galaxy had come to witness what they believed would be the shortest and most one-sided fight in galactic history. The noise was incredible. Hundreds of different species talked, laughed, and made bets about how quickly the small human female would die. Some wagered she would last less than 10 seconds. In the expensive seats closest to the arena floor, Warlord Vextar sat with other high-ranking members of his species. They wore their finest ceremonial armor, polished to mirror brightness. The warlord's yellow eyes glowed with anticipation as he watched the arena floor below. Ambassador Yule and Kong Day sat in the human section, which was located in the cheapest area near the top of the dome. They were the only humans in the entire arena besides Hannah herself. Ambassador Yule's face was pale with worry, and his hands shook slightly as he gripped the railing in front of him. "She knows what she is doing," Kong Day said quietly, though his own voice was tight with concern. Ambassador Yule nodded, but his expression remained fearful. "I have read every report about Kethmori combat methods," he whispered. "Their warriors train from childhood to kill. Torquen has fought in real battles across 3 star systems. What could she possibly know that we do not?" Before Kong Day could answer, a loud horn sounded throughout the arena. The crowd noise began to die down as everyone turned their attention to the entrance tunnels on opposite sides of the arena floor. Torquen emerged first from the eastern tunnel. He wore full Kethmori battle armor that covered him from head to toe in overlapping metal plates. Each plate was decorated with symbols showing his victories in combat. His helmet was shaped like the skull of some dangerous predator, with glowing yellow eyepieces that matched his natural eyes. In his hands, he carried traditional Kethmori weapons. His right hand held a curved sword as long as a human is tall, with edges sharp enough to cut through steel. His left hand gripped a spiked shield that could be used to block attacks or to smash enemies into pieces. The crowd cheered wildly as he walked to the center of the arena. He raised both weapons above his head and roared a battle cry that echoed off the dome walls. The sound was like a dragon challenging the world to combat. Then the western tunnel opened, and Hannah stepped onto the arena floor. The cheering stopped, as if someone had turned off a switch. The arena became so quiet that the hum of the space station's engines could be heard through the walls. Hannah wore simple human clothing she had changed out of her diplomatic uniform, into plain black pants and a white shirt that allowed her to move freely. Her feet were protected by soft shoes designed for exercise rather than combat. She carried no weapons that anyone could see. She wore no armor at all. Her black hair was pulled back in the same simple style she had worn to the diplomatic meetings. Her face was calm and peaceful, showing no fear or anger. She walked across the arena floor with steady steps, neither hurrying nor delaying. The contrast between the two fighters was so extreme that many aliens began to laugh again. Torkon looked like a walking fortress of death and destruction. Hannah looked like she was going for a casual walk in a park. When she reached the center of the arena, she stopped about 20 feet away from Torkon and stood quietly with her hands at her sides. Torkon removed his helmet and let it fall to the arena floor with a loud crash. "I will make your death quick if you admit that humans are the weakest species in the galaxy." Hannah did not respond. She continued to stand calmly, her eyes focused on his face rather than his weapons. The referee, a tall alien with blue skin and 4 arms, stepped forward to announce the rules. "This is single combat under Kethmori tradition," he declared in the common galactic language. "No outside interference is permitted. Begin when you hear the signal." The referee stepped back to the edge of the arena and raised one of his 4 hands. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the signal that would start what they expected to be a massacre. The signal horn, his sword swept through the air in a massive arc designed to cut Hannah in half with a single strike. Last possible second, stepping aside so smoothly that she seemed to flow like water around his attack. The sword passed through empty air, where she had been standing just a moment before. Torkoness, he spun around quickly, expecting to find her cowering behind him, but she was already moving again. This time he attacked more carefully, using his shield to guard while he made precise strikes with his sword. Duck under a sword strike, then step sideways to avoid the shield. She would lean backward as the blade passed inches from her face, then step forward to avoid the return swing. The crowd began to murmur nervously. The human was not fighting back, but she was also not dying. She was simply avoiding every attack with movements so smooth they looked almost effortless. Torkon began to breathe harder inside his armor. Sweat began to run down his scaled face as he continued his assault. Hannah showed no signs of tiredness. Her breathing remained steady and calm. Her movements never became rushed or desperate. She continued to flow around his attacks like she could see them coming before he made them. "Stand still and fight," Torkon roared in frustration. He began to attack faster, putting more power behind each strike. The sound of his sword cutting through the air filled the arena like thunder. But faster attacks meant wilder attacks. More powerful strikes meant less control. And Hannah continued to move with the same calm precision, staying just out of reach of his weapons. The crowd had become completely silent. They were watching something they had never seen before and did not understand. The small human female was not just surviving against a trained Kethmori warrior. She was making him look clumsy and desperate. Warlord Vextar leaned forward in his seat, his yellow eyes narrow with concentration. "Now they begin to see," he whispered to Ambassador Yule. Ambassador Yule stared at the arena floor in amazement. "She is not even trying to attack him," he said. "She is just letting him tire himself out." On the arena floor, Torkon was beginning to slow down. His attacks were becoming less frequent and less precise. The weight of his armor and weapons was taking its toll, and his earlier drinking was not helping his stamina. Hannah continued to move around him in the same calm pattern. The crowd sensed that something was about to change. The air in the arena became thick with tension as thousands of beings held their breath and waited. To see what would happen next, Torkon raised his sword for another massive strike, putting all of his remaining strength behind the attack. It was meant to be the blow that would finally end the fight and restore his honor. But as his sword began to fall, Hannah stepped forward instead of back. For the first time in the entire fight, and in that moment, everything changed. Torkon's sword came down with all the force he could manage. The blade cut through the air with a sound like screaming wind. This was his strongest attack, meant to split his enemy from head to waist in one terrible blow. But Hannah was no longer where he expected her to be. Instead of stepping away from the attack, she had moved forward and to the side. As his sword swept down through empty air, she was suddenly beside him, closer than she had been during the entire fight. For a moment that seemed to last forever. Torkon was completely exposed. His sword was buried in the arena floor where she should have been. His shield was on the wrong side to protect him. His heavy armor made it impossible for him to change direction quickly. And, Handra was right there next to him. She moved with the same fluid grace she had shown throughout the fight. But now her movements had a different purpose. Her right hand reached out and grabbed his sword arm at the wrist, just below where his armor ended. Her left hand found a pressure point on his elbow that made his fingers go numb. The massive sword fell from his grip and clattered across the arena floor before Torkin could react. Hannah twisted his arm with a movement so quick and precise that most of the crowd missed it entirely. There was a sharp crack that echoed through the silent arena like a breaking branch. Torkin screamed. The sound was unlike anything the crowd had ever heard from a Kethmori warrior. It was high and desperate. Full of pain and shock and disbelief, he fell to his knees on the metal floor, clutching his broken arm. Against his chest, his shield fell beside him with a crash that seemed impossibly loud in the silence that followed. Hannah stepped back and stood quietly, her hands once again at her sides. She was not even breathing hard. There was no sweat on her face, no sign that she had just been in a life-or-death battle with one of the galaxy's most feared warriors. The arena remained completely silent for several long seconds. 10,000 beings from across the galaxy stared at the scene before them and tried to understand what they had just witnessed. Torkin was still on his knees, his broken arm hanging at an impossible angle. His armor, which had made him look so dangerous just minutes before, now seemed like nothing more than heavy metal that weighed him down. Hannah stood over him, small and quiet and completely unhurt. Then the whispers began. They started in the back, rose and spread forward like water flowing downhill. Aliens turned to each other and spoke in hushed, shocked voices. The translation devices in their ears worked frantically to keep up with the dozens of languages being spoken at once. In the expensive seats near the arena floor, Warlord Vextar rose slowly from his chair. His yellow eyes were wide with an emotion that no one had ever seen on his face before. Fear. The referee stepped forward, his forearms shaking as he approached the center of the arena. He looked down at Torkin, then up at Hannah, then back at Torkin again. "The fight is over," he announced, though his voice cracked as he spoke. "The human fighter is victorious." But victory was not the only thing that had happened in the arena. Everyone present understood that something much more important had been decided in Kethmori culture. Being defeated in single combat meant more than just losing a fight. It meant losing honor, losing status, losing the respect of your people. But being defeated by what they considered the weakest species in the galaxy meant something far worse. It meant complete and total shame. Torkin would never be able to hold his head up among his own people again. No Kethmori would ever take orders from him or show him respect. His right to inherit his father's position as warlord was gone forever. But the damage went even deeper than that. If the weakest species in the galaxy could defeat a Kethmori warrior so easily, what did that say about Kethmori's strength? If a small human female could break Torkin's arm like a dry stick, how strong were the Kethmori really? Warlord Vextar understood this better than anyone. He had built his power on the fear that other species felt when they looked at Kethmori warriors. That fear was based on the belief that no one could stand against them in battle. But now, in front of representatives from every major species in the galaxy, that belief had been shattered as completely as his son's arm. Hannah walked across the arena floor toward the exit tunnel. She did not look back at Torkin or acknowledge the stares that followed her every step. She moved with the same calm dignity she had shown throughout her time on the space station. As she reached the tunnel entrance, she paused and turned back to face the crowd. When she spoke, her voice was still soft, but somehow it carried every seat in the arena. "I did not come here to fight," she said simply. "I came here to talk about trade and peace between our species. But if anyone else believes that humans are too weak to defend themselves, they are welcome to test that belief." She looked directly at Warlord Vextar as she continued. "We prefer to solve problems with words rather than violence, but we are very good at violence when it becomes necessary." Then she turned and walked into the tunnel, disappearing from view. The arena remained silent for a long moment after she left. Then, slowly, the crowd began to stir. Aliens rose from their seats and started moving toward the exits. But there, conversations were very different from the loud, confident talk that had filled the arena before the fight. Now they spoke in worried whispers about what they had just seen. They talked about the need to reconsider their opinions about human capabilities. They discussed whether their own species would be able to defend themselves if humans ever decided to become aggressive. In the human section, Kangde and Ambassador Yule made their way down toward the arena floor. They found Hannah waiting for them in the tunnel, calmly cleaning Torken's blood from her hands with a small cloth. "How long have you been able to do that?" Ambassador Yule asked, his voice full of amazement. Hannah looked up at him with the same peaceful expression she always wore. "Earth has many different fighting styles," she said quietly. "I have studied 12 of them. The one I use today is called Aikido. It teaches you to use an opponent's strength and aggression against them." Kangde shook his head in admiration. "You made it look easy." "It was easy," Hannah replied. "He was strong and fast, but he had no technique. He relied completely on his weapons and armor instead of understanding how to fight. When I took those advantages away from him, he had nothing left." She folded the cloth carefully and put it in her pocket. "Tomorrow we return to the trade negotiations. I suspect they will go much more smoothly now." As they walked back toward their quarters, the news of what had happened in the arena was already spreading throughout the space station and beyond. Communication signals raced toward every corner of the galaxy, carrying the impossible story of how the weakest species had defeated one of the strongest. By the time they reached their rooms, the first responses were already coming back. Species that had planned to ignore the human requests for trade agreements were suddenly very interested in talking. Others that had considered humanity an easy target for expansion were rapidly reconsidering their plans. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted in the space of a single fight, and everyone was beginning to understand that the quiet, peaceful humans might be the most dangerous species of all. The medical bay of the space station was filled with the sounds of advanced healing machines working to repair Torken's broken arm. The Kethmori warrior sat on an examination table while robot doctors moved around him, their mechanical arms placing his bones back together and sealing the damage. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the shame that burned in his chest. Through the transparent walls of the medical bay, he could see other aliens walking past in the corridor outside. Every single one of them stared at him. Some pointed and whispered to their companions. Others simply shook their heads in disbelief. He was no longer Torken the Feared, heir to a mighty warlord. He was now Torken the Broken, the warrior who had been defeated by a small human female in front of the entire galaxy. Warlord Vexstar stood in the corner of the medical bay, his arms crossed over his massive chest. His yellow eyes burned with anger, but the anger was not directed at Hannah or the humans. It was directed at his son and at himself for allowing this disaster to happen. "The Council of Elders has already sent a message," the warlord said, his voice like grinding stone. "They have seen the recordings of your defeat. They want to know how the heir to the Vexstar bloodline could be humiliated by a creature they—" Torken did not look up from the floor. His voice was barely a whisper when he spoke. "I do not understand what happened, Father." She moved like she knew every attack I would make before I made it. It was like fighting a ghost, and now our entire family must live with the shame of that truth. Outside the medical bay, the news of the fight was spreading, faster than anyone had expected. The space station's communication systems were working at maximum capacity as species from across the galaxy sent and received messages about what they had witnessed. In the human quarters, Ambassador Yule sat at his desk reading message after message from Earth's government. Each one asked the same questions. How had Hannah defeated a Kethmori warrior? What other capabilities did Earth's people possess? Were there more humans like her? Hannah herself sat quietly in the corner of the room, reading reports on her personal datapad. She seemed completely unaffected by the chaos her victory had created. To anyone watching, she looked like she was simply catching up on routine paperwork. Kangde entered the room carrying a steaming cup of Earth coffee, which he handed to Ambassador Yule. "The station's communication officers say they have never seen anything like this," he reported. "Every species in the galaxy is trying to get more information about what happened in the arena." Ambassador Yule took a sip of his coffee and sighed. "What do we tell them?" "We tell them the truth," Hannah said, without looking up from her datapad. "Earth trains its people to be capable in many different areas: diplomacy, science, engineering, and yes, personal combat. We believe in being prepared for any situation. She finally looked up and met Ambassador Yule's eyes. The mistake the other species made was assuming that being peaceful means being helpless. Earth has always known the difference. Ambassador Yule nodded slowly. How many people on Earth have your level of combat training? More than the galaxy would be comfortable knowing about, Hannah replied simply. Before Ambassador Yule could ask another question, the door chime sounded. Kongde answered it and found a messenger from the Galactic Council waiting outside. The Council requests the immediate presence of the human delegation in the main chamber. The messenger announced, all major species representatives will be present. They arrived at the Council chamber to find it more crowded than it had been during their first meeting. Representatives who had not bothered to attend the original trade discussions were now present, along with military advisors and cultural experts from dozens of different species. The atmosphere in the room was completely different from before, where there had once been laughter and dismissive attitudes toward the humans. There was now nervous tension and careful attention to every word. Ambassador Yule took his place at the human table. With Hannah and Kongde beside him, the placement of their table had not changed, but the way other species looked at them certainly had. The council chairman, a tall being with silver skin and multiple arms, called for order. We are here to discuss the events that occurred in the combat arena this morning, he announced. The implications of these events affect every species present. Warlord Vextar stood up from his seat near the center of the chamber. His voice was strained as he spoke, lacking the confident power it had held just one day before. The Kethmori Dominion wishes to make a formal statement, he said. What happened in the arena was an unexpected outcome that does not reflect the true strength of our species. Several other representatives began to murmur among themselves. Everyone understood what the warlord was trying to do. He was attempting to minimize the damage to his people's reputation by suggesting that his son's defeat was some kind of accident or lucky chance. But Ambassador Yule had been preparing for this moment. He rose from his chair and requested permission. I think there are some facts about human capabilities that this council should understand. The chairman nodded, and Ambassador Yule stepped forward to address the entire assembly. Hannah is indeed skilled in personal combat, he began. But she is not unique among our people. She is a diplomat first and foremost. Her combat training is considered basic by Earth standards. A wave of shocked whispers ran through the chamber. On Earth, we have a saying, speak softly and carry a big stick. This means that we prefer peaceful solutions to our problems, but we are always prepared to defend ourselves if peace is not possible. Earth has been preparing for contact with other species for many decades. We studied every piece of information we could find about galactic cultures, including Kethmori combat methods. We know the strengths and weaknesses of every major species represented in this chamber. The silence that followed this statement was complete. Every being in the room was processing the implications of what they had just heard. You have been studying US, asked the representative from the Crystalline Federation, her voice high with alarm. Of course, Ambassador Yule replied calmly. Just as you have been studying us since our first contact, the difference is that we have been more thorough in our preparations. He gestured toward Hannah, who remained seated calmly at the human table. Hannah knew exactly how Torkin would fight because she had studied hundreds of hours of recordings, showing Kethmori combat techniques. That is why she was able to avoid his attacks so easily, Ambassador Yule continued. She was not just reacting to what he did, she was anticipating what he would do, based on his training and background. The chamber erupted in nervous chatter as representatives from various species began to discuss the implications among themselves. If humans had been studying them so carefully, what else did Earth know? What other preparations had they made? Warlord, are you saying that humans have been planning for war with us? Not war, Ambassador Yule replied firmly. Defense. There is an important difference. We came to this council seeking peaceful trade and cooperation. But we came prepared to protect ourselves if cooperation was not possible. He looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of representatives from every major species. What happened in the arena was not a display of human aggression. It was a demonstration of human preparedness. We hope that all species present will remember this distinction. The council chairman called for a brief recess to allow the various delegations to discuss what they had learned. as the chamber began calmly organizing their notes for the afternoon's trade discussions. But now, instead of being ignored or dismissed, and everyone was beginning to understand that the quiet, peaceful humans might be the most dangerous opponents of all. 3 months had passed since the fight in the arena, and the galaxy was still adjusting to its new understanding of humanity. The trade negotiations had resumed the afternoon, following Hannah's victory, but the atmosphere was completely different. Where before the human delegation had been seated in the worst section of the chamber and largely ignored, now they found themselves moved to a place of honor near the center. Every proposal they made was listened to carefully. Every request they submitted was given serious consideration. Species that had planned to offer them scraps from existing trade routes now competed to offer them the most profitable partnerships. The Crystalline Federation, which had originally refused to even acknowledge human requests for mining rights, suddenly discovered that they had several unexploited asteroid fields they would be happy to share. The Aquatic Collective, which had dismissed human shipping capabilities, now wanted to hire Earth vessels to transport their goods across the galaxy. Even more telling were the requests that began arriving from species military commands. They wanted to know if Earth would be interested in providing security services for their trade routes. They asked about hiring human advisors to train their own forces. They inquired about purchasing Earth weapons and defensive systems. Ambassador Yul handled these requests with the same calm diplomacy he had always shown, but now his words carried weight that they had never had before. When he spoke of Earth's desire for peaceful cooperation, other species listened carefully and took him seriously. Hannah had returned to her regular diplomatic duties as if nothing unusual had happened. She attended meetings, reviewed trade documents, and participated in cultural exchange programs with the same quiet efficiency she had always displayed. But now, when she entered a room, conversations stopped. When she spoke, even the most powerful representatives leaned forward to hear her words. When she made suggestions about resolving disputes between species, those suggestions were immediately implemented. The respect she commanded was not based on fear, though there was certainly an element of that. It was based on the recognition that she represented a species that was far more capable than anyone had imagined. The changes were most visible in how other species interacted with all humans, not just the diplomatic delegation. Human traders, who had previously been cheated or overcharged, now found themselves receiving fair deals and respectful treatment. Human tourists were welcomed with courtesy rather than condescension. Human students applying to galactic universities were accepted eagerly rather than reluctantly. But perhaps the most dramatic change could be seen in what had happened to the Kethmori Dominion. Torkin never recovered from his defeat. The shame of losing to what his people considered the weakest species in the galaxy made it impossible for him to function as a warrior or leader. He had been quietly removed from the line of succession and sent to live in exile on a distant mining colony. Warlord Vextar's position had become increasingly unstable. Other Kethmori leaders questioned his judgment and his ability to lead their people. If he could not even properly evaluate the threat level of potential enemies, how could he be trusted to make strategic decisions for their entire species? More damaging was the effect on the Kethmoria's relationships with other species. The Dominion had built its power on the fear and respect that other civilizations felt for Kethmori's military might. But if a single unarmed human could defeat their best warrior so easily, how dangerous were they really? 3 of the Kethmori's client species had already declared independence, confident that they could defend themselves against retaliation. 2 others had formed a defensive alliance and were openly challenging Kethmori. Territorial claims, the mighty dominion that had ruled 12 star systems, was cracking apart, and everyone knew that the destruction had begun with one broken arm in an arena. Hannah sat at her desk writing her final report to Earth's government. The document detailed the successful completion of humanity's entry into galactic civilization, but it also contained warnings and recommendations for the future. The respect we have gained comes with responsibilities, she wrote. Other species now see us as a major power in galactic affairs. They will expect us to act like one. This means we must be prepared to intervene in conflicts, mediate disputes, and occasionally enforce peace through strength. She paused in her writing to look out the window at the stars beyond. Somewhere among those points of light were the worlds of dozens of species, all of them now aware that humanity was not the weak newcomer they had first appeared to be. "We must be careful not to become what we replaced," she continued. "The Kethmori fell because they relied too heavily on intimidation and forgot that true strength comes from wisdom, not just force. We must remember that our goal is not to dominate the galaxy, but to find our proper place within it." A soft chime indicated that someone was requesting entry to her quarters. She opened the door to find Kong Day waiting outside, carrying a message pad. "New communications from Earth," he said, handing her the device. "The President wants to know if we think humanity is ready for the responsibilities that come with our new status." Hannah read through the message carefully. Earth's leaders were beginning to understand that their planet's relationship with the galaxy had changed permanently. They would need to make decisions about military expansion, diplomatic commitments, and resource allocation that would affect billions of people. "What do you think?" Kongde asked. "Are we ready?" Hannah considered the question seriously before answering. "I think we are as ready as any species can be," she said finally. "We have the knowledge, the technology, and the wisdom to use our strength responsibly. Whether we will actually do so remains to be seen." She turned back to her report and added, "One final paragraph. The other species of the galaxy spent decades underestimating humanity because we appeared weak and peaceful. Now they must learn not to make the opposite mistake. We are strong, but we are not aggressive. We are capable of violence, but we prefer peace. We are prepared for war, but we hope never to wage one. The challenge for Earth's future will be maintaining this balance. We must remain strong enough to defend ourselves and our allies, but wise enough to know when strength should be used and when it should be held in reserve." As she finished writing, Hannah reflected on how much had changed. Since she first arrived at the space station 3 months ago, humans had been the newest and weakest members of galactic civilization. Now, they were recognized as one of the most potentially dangerous species in known space. But with that recognition came opportunities that previous generations of humans could never have imagined. Earth's children would grow up as citizens of a galaxy-spanning community. They would have access to knowledge and technology from thousands of different worlds. They would be able to travel among the stars as easily as their ancestors had traveled between countries. All of this had been made possible by one moment of violence in an arena. When the galaxy learned that humanity's greatest strength was not their weapons or their technology, but their ability to appear weak while remaining strong. The next morning, the human delegation prepared to leave the space station and return to Earth. As they walked through the corridors toward their ship, other species stepped aside to let them pass. The gestures were respectful rather than fearful, acknowledging equals rather than avoiding superiors at the departure gate. Ambassador Yule paused to shake hands with several alien diplomats who had become genuine friends over the past months. The relationships that had formed after the arena fight were based on mutual respect rather than the condescension that had marked earlier interactions. As their ship pulled away from the space station and began its journey back to Earth, Hannah looked back at the structure growing smaller in the distance. She knew that she would return someday, probably many times, as humanity took its place as a permanent member of galactic civilization. But she also knew that when she did return, it would be as a representative of a species that was no longer underestimated by anyone. The galaxy had learned its lesson about judging humanity by appearances. Now came the harder task of proving that they deserved the respect they had earned.